Dr. Ingrid Waldron should not need an introduction. The leading voice on environmental racism in Canada and author of There's Something in the Water, Waldron has built a reputation for being unusually skilled at working with and within community and at reading the social landscape for fluctuations in the way that power works. She's the Hope Chair in Peace and Health in the Global Peace and Social Justice Program at McMaster University, and both the founder and director of the ENRICH Project, which has been a crucial source of organizational strength, culminating now in a series of funding announcements and some serious policy changes as Environmental Justice Bill C-226 is debated in Canada's Parliament. Ingrid's commitment to public engagement and to publicizing the fact of environmental racism has made a huge impact in Nova Scotia, but it's also been an inspiration to people globally, in part because of the success of the 2019 Netflix adaptation of There's Something in the Water. Waldron's radical definition of environmental racism is, as far as I'm concerned, the most precise one. She describes it in terms of the, quote, white supremacist use of space, and explains how the white supremacist use of space manifests in the disproportionate placement of polluting industries in Indigenous and Black communities. From that powerful definition, Ingrid develops an argument that leaves a mark by detailing how the fact of environmental racism is rooted in, quote, boundary-making practices that create social hierarchies, and why environmental racism is related to other structurally induced racial and gendered forms of state violence. This all has a history, and that history matters because it manifests itself as a combination of ecological destruction and social violence. We talk here about how racial capitalism influences and in some cases even determines the politics of places like Nova Scotia and Flint, Michigan, which have seen intergenerational struggles over how polluting industries are sited. We also discuss Indigenous sovereignty and the wisdom of Indigenous land and water protectors for thinking more expansively about health, wellness, and the treatment of the body's ills. So while the language of holistic medicine has been wholly co-opted in many ways, Waldron looks to reclaim and recover the concept, reminding us that this includes all of the medicines the land provides, as well as social relationships with family members and the wider community. It's amazing to get to speak with you about this obviously very influential work that you've done. What I find really kind of impressive, I guess, is how open you are about the things that you have learned through the process of doing community-based research. But at the same time that you are talking about that and kind of narrating that journey, there's also this like really, strong theoretical basis for the work that you're doing in terms of like literally the terms that you're using. And like there is a moment in your book, There's Something in the Water, where you say the term environmental racism is increasingly being used in Nova Scotia and Canada, but there still seems to be a preference for the term environmental justice rather than environmental racism. I think that is an interesting place for us to maybe start. Where's your thinking at in terms of like the politics of language when it comes to mobilizing people for climate action or against environmental racism?
Well, there's definitely a politics of language with respect to environmental racism because when you look at the literature, the Canadian literature on environmental injustices over the last 20 years, I found that most academics or the individuals who write scholarly articles use the term environmental uh, justice. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a term that doesn't point to the condition or the problem. Environmental justice means we have justice, but we don't have justice, right? So it's obscuring the condition or the illness, if you will, around environmental racism. So I always say that before we talk about justice and environmental justice, we have to talk about the illness. It's similar to when you go to your doctor.
Mm-hmm.
You want to know the diagnosis first. You want to know the condition. You want to know about your illness before you will take the prescription, before you'll take the medication. And I think with scholars who talk about environmental justice, there's a kind of dismissiveness about the causal factors of environmental racism. So you got to look deeply into the factors that create environmental racism and who is impacted before we can talk about how to do the justice, because how we do the justice will be shaped by the factors that's causing environmental racism and who is impacted. Um, so, environmental racism, when we think about that term, it tells us that there is a disproportionate impact on communities of color, on Indigenous communities with respect to toxic facilities. And when we think about how we address that issue, then that's when we start thinking about the projects or activities that will allow us to achieve justice with respect to environmental racism, with respect to the illness, to the condition of environmental racism. For me in Canada, that use of the term environmental justice as an overarching term to describe, I guess, the problems is not specific enough. It doesn't center on race, it doesn't look at the specific communities that are impacted. And I don't know if that's deliberate or not. Um, but certainly, when I started talking a lot more about environmental racism when I was in Nova Scotia, I was opening up a conversation about racism more than what I had seen from the ENGOs that I was interacting with, and the
Hmm.
students that I was interacting with, and the scholars. Uh, and it became kind of controversial, or, the responses that I got from many people were, come on, this is strange. How can the environment be racist? Without people looking at the systemic nature of environmental racism, that it's an outcome of environmental policies and decision making made by individuals who get the privilege to make those policies. And when they make those policies and those policies are implemented, some communities are protected and others are not protected. You have to get deep. You have
Hmm.
to get deep to kind of understand all of those issues before you start thinking about what are the tools that need to be used to achieve environmental justice. So, because I've done that work and I went deep into the issue, I thought that one way to deal with it, for example, would be the environmental racism bill that's now in front of Senate, right? But you cannot talk about the tools um, that would help you achieve environmental justice until you do a real critical analysis of the causal factors, what's causing it, the diagnosis, the illness, the condition, and who's being impacted.
Yeah, I hear that, and there's so much in that response. I think there within Nova Scotia, you've talked about how to kind of pick up on what you're saying in terms of speculating on whether that lack of specificity is deliberate. You say that it's really kind of mired in a colorblind ideology.
Mhm.
Maybe like that there clearly is within Nova Scotia and broadly in Canada this sort of multicultural narrative of Canadian statehood that doesn't want to believe that something like that could exist. And so there's this, as you say, dismissiveness, this reluctance to look deeply.
Mhm.
Your point around the kind of systemic, deep seated nature of it is where I might like to take things in terms of kind of allowing the audience into this discussion of environmental racism. Because from your perspective, like if we're going to diagnose it, then we really have to look at, as you put it, the less obvious ways in which the white supremacist use of space manifests in the disproportionate placement of these toxic things, polluting industries in Indigenous and Black communities. Um, and when you talk about policy, when you talk about legal tools, are you sort of thinking about the ways in which all these legal tools that support boundary making practices that create social hierarchies can be, on some level, subverted, or is it about actually kind of more trying to expose it?
I think for me, it's trying to expose it. I think when you expose these issues, then you can identify the ways to address them. So,
Hmm.
I was doing my work on environmental racism, and I read an article by George Lipschitz, who used to be at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And that opened my eyes around environmental racism being simply one example of the white supremacist use of space. We can also add gentrification to that. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
he and others talked about this white spatial imaginary, the kind of romanticized images that white people have around space, and seeing racialized people as tainting that space. So when I think of, for example, planners, industry owners, business people, uh, who are contributing to the gentrification or gentrifying of various spaces in Toronto, across the country, there's a white spatial imaginary of how they want spaces to look, to be perceived, but also material space in terms of being untainted by low income, racialized others who they see as problematic in many ways, who they see as criminals. And these are certainly policy issues. It starts from policy where you have people who make those decisions who certainly do not look like myself and do not look like impacted communities. That is what they're trying to create, and they use policy to create that, and sometimes legal tools to create that. Um, so space to me is really, really important. I see everything now with respect to space and place.
Mm-hmm.
Urban planning issues where some communities have various advantages. For example, some communities get to be on municipal water, and other communities like the black community in Shelburne, Nova Scotia, is still on well water, or the fact that Shelburne does not have sidewalks and the white community in the north of Shelburne has sidewalks, and people will think, big deal. They don't have sidewalks. Sidewalks are a health issue. A lot of people don't see it that way. It's
Right.
also a safety issue. So I think that article and my engagement with this notion of space and place and race and the spatial imaginary and the white supremacist use of space is about how white people seek to carve out spaces that are untainted by racial others, and the actions that they engage in, all that are distilled from policy, have that goal
Mm-hmm.
of excluding people of color, of sometimes not even thinking about them. You know, there's policy that could be disruptive and problematic. And then we have the absence of policy, which is where we could look at certain communities, particularly low income and racialized communities, and ask, why is there not a healthy food store there? Why is there not green space? Why don't we have canopies, which is certainly connected to climate change and heat?
For
Why
sure.
is it that certain communities are food deserts, right? This is not, so it's not simply about policies that are implemented in communities that often harm them on the ground, but it's also about communities that tend to be forgotten and the absence of policies because certain communities are seen as not having value and not
Mm-hmm.
mattering. All of this is connected,
Yeah.
and they're individual issues or problems kind of under one broad stroke. And it's about white supremacy, certainly. It's about the way in which white people want to see spaces and places.
And that I think, the thing that you've given others then is like that similar ability to kind of, illuminate the truth, right? This kind of obscured fact that space is, as you sometimes put it, like spatialized, right?
Mhm,
That there are ways in which you say industry owners carve out spatialities of profit that ultimately lead to possession, dispossession, and displacement.
mhm,
Clearly you're using language in ways that allow us to kind of recognize that
mhm,
reality.
mhm,
It's not this kind of it's not that form of theory that is this like tangled involuted thing. Like you are trying to expose material realities that are created by policies,
mhm,
and that I think is what has been so invigorating for people in terms of engaging with your work.
mhm,
Here in Nova Scotia, we have an institution like the Akuma Family Center, and I talk to people at Akuma, which is, I guess, the largest Black land holding in Canada, and they talk about these similar things. Like, just practically speaking, they can't get access to these kind of basic resources. They are prevented from developing on their land in specific ways because of like zoning laws, right? And so I think communicating that in a way that's impactful and that just like is sense making and helps people kind of understand it, as you say, within this kind of broader ideology of white supremacy, is obviously going to be interpreted by some as like too political or too polemical. And that's sort of where I thought we could maybe shift toward, is toward like this structure of thinking that is about trying to actually, as you say, name the ways in which a capitalist economy based on consumption normalizes a lot of these relationships to the land and to resources and ultimately to people within a colonial system. You say ultimately racial capitalism harms racialized peoples through the reinforcement of social and economic inequalities that have the most disadvantageous impacts on racialized peoples, whose economic well-being is determined by their market value. How are you seeing that sort of iteration of capitalism manifest today as we face all of these kinds of overlapping crises?
Yeah, what I argue in the book is that we should never talk about or think about capitalism without thinking about it as racial capitalism. And typically, when we talk about capitalism, uh, we don't connect it
Mm-hmm.
to racial capitalism. But when we, for example, environmental racism, I say, is an example of racial capitalism. But capitalism as a whole is about the ways in which we exploit the bodies of indigenous people of color, low income people, people who are gendered in particular ways, including women. Um, there's an exploitation of their bodies and their capital and their work and their being for profit. So we all know that capitalism is about the accumulation of profit, and certainly with environmental racism, that's what it's about. It's about the accumulation of profit. It's about going into communities like indigenous communities for the purposes of exploitation, for resources. Uh, but also when we talk about the genocide of indigenous people, the loss of their culture, everything is connected to the past, of course. So the exploitation of their resources and the exploitation of their communities, the loss of language, all of these things are a result of capitalism. But capitalism happens on the bodies of marginalized communities who are already experiencing various social inequalities, who are already living in contexts or communities that have social fabrics that are weakened by various social ills, whether we're talking about food insecurity or income insecurity and poverty, being disproportionately impacted by health issues and diseases. These are communities with existing distractions, making their communities very vulnerable. But capitalism happens on their backs and it worsens the conditions that they are experiencing. Um, and those are the communities that are most impacted. So, racial capitalism as a concept, the race and the capitalism must go together in every context. And when we talk about these issues, because in every case, whether we talk about environmental racism, gentrification, climate change, and other issues that are happening in our world, it's those who are most marginalized, and it's always those who are racialized, because the people who are most marginalized or low income also happen to be people who are racialized and indigenous. It is always happening on their backs. So the profit that is accumulated happens on their backs. And when I talk about market value,
Mm-hmm.
I also talk about neoliberalism in my book, and I look at the intersection of neoliberalism, racial capitalism, and environmental racism. Neoliberalism is about this notion that all that matters is market value. All that matters is whether or not you're a player in the economic system. With neoliberalism, there isn't a lot of thought about the human and social and health side.
No, yeah.
They're not concerned about the health effects of environmental racism like I might be and others might be. So we always have to think about capitalism as something that makes certain communities more vulnerable, is using certain communities in various ways to produce profit.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not something that's neutral or should be seen as normative. It's something that has a racial overtone, always does.
Mm-hmm.
I think in Canada and elsewhere, when we think of these topics, we think of class, whether it's capitalism or neoliberalism. We're thinking mostly of income and certainly class. And I think you mentioned earlier that there's an obscuring. But when we use the term environmental justice, we obscure
Mm-hmm.
the issue of race. Yeah, it's because there's a foregrounding of the issue of class. Certainly, when I started the project, my environmental racism project, I had people reach out to me on email saying to me or asking me, "Isn't this about class, Dr. Waldron? Why are you making it about race?" And I said to them, I said, why can't it be about both? Because the reality is, environmental racism sits at the intersection of race, class, socioeconomic status, gender, and also geography, where one lives. Similarly, when we use these terms as racial capitalism and neoliberalism, we have to do those intersections. I think we typically have a class first approach.
Right.
I have an intersectional approach, which looks at gender and class and disability and sexual orientation. All of those things must come into play when we talk about these concepts.
Yeah, and to me, like that is like not just a more sophisticated and multidimensional picture, the intersectional picture. It's also just like more practical in terms of like building a movement. This is something that you talk about certainly in your book, where you refer to this kind of horizon, this imperative of building alliances between different organizations across these lines. But yeah, the intersectional way of approaching the struggle for what is really just a kind of like liberation from racial capitalism, I think, and colonialism, um, is to me more practical because, as you say, like it is about building these more reciprocal relationships and alliances, and creating. I love this phrase: a common vision of change. There is this temptation maybe toward the more simplistic narrative of
Mhm.
just like somehow spontaneously overcoming these things without diagnosing them. But your diagnosis of power to me is really super sharp. You're saying that there are all these different factors that converge in the kind of creation of a toxic system, basically. So when you create that almost like inventory of blockages, are you in some ways trying to diagnose power for your readers so that they can kind of like see the barriers and maybe figure out tools to overcome them? And have you seen that kind of operating within social movements that you've participated in that are fighting these forces?
Yeah, I'm excavating that for the readers because I think when I created that list, I realized that they were subtle and systemic.
Mm-hmm.
And we always tend to go towards maliciousness.
Right.
Maybe in this particular issue of environmental racism, there are people that I know think it's all about maliciousness. And I say to some of them, I said, I don't think people are sitting in a room purposely planning to harm people, but their actions are harming people because those actions are happening in very subtle and systemic ways, in ways that the people who are making decisions may not actually be aware of. And some people would say to me, I don't agree. I think it's just maliciousness. I don't believe that. I believe in the good of people typically, but I think policy, yes, is malicious, but it's very subtle. So I think the people who make decisions, I always say, are navigating those decisions based on how they navigate their world. So if you are a white middle class man, you only know one world. That's the world that you navigate in. When you wake up in the morning, that's really all you know. I can't fault you for that,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what you know. So when you make policies out of a particular perspective or vision, it may be harmful to people who are not white, male, and straight, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But you may not know any better. In order to know better, you may have then needed to get some education on it. Maybe you take a class on anti-racism, or you have friends who are racialized, or something in your life makes you recognize the oppression of others, or you come kind of you're confronted with it in very overt, obvious ways. So people are navigating and developing policies based on their worldview, and that's the only worldview that they have. So when I list some of those things, it's about allowing the reader to understand that there's so much that's going into the placement of, for example, facility in a particular community. And I talk a lot about environmental assessments in my book because I think that's a perfect example of how decision making, problematic decision making, leads to the placement of facilities in certain communities. And people are not thinking of some of these things, but when environmental assessments are done from a Euro Western perspective, done primarily by environmental scientists, it leaves out a lot of different perspectives. For example, there's a professor that I'm aware of who got a grant to look at environmental assessments, and he's brought together people from different disciplines. That's the way to go. He's brought together, I need to kind of find out what's happened to that project. But when he told me about it, I thought this is how it should be done. You need to have health professionals on board. You need to have the environmental scientists, of course. You also need to have the political science professor
Mm-hmm.
and the sociologist, et cetera, because the solution for me to most problems in the world or every problem is interdisciplinary. And I've seen that with my work. So I find that environmental assessments are really a great way to reveal to readers and to others the kind of subtle ways, the discriminatory ways that environmental assessments are made that then lead to the placement in certain communities over the placement of facilities in certain communities over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And that then allows people to think about the ways that that can be disrupted. For me, it's what this professor is doing, is to bring together an interdisciplinary team to find the solution to environmental racism. In other words, to find the solution to why we keep placing it in Indigenous communities, facilities in Indigenous communities. When I talk about the fact that consultations are done, perhaps not in Indigenous led ways, or thinking about Indigenous knowledges or Indigenous epistemologies, when you place a call out to community members for consultations and you're placing it in publications that they don't read or they're not aware of it. Um, I don't know if that's malicious intent or that's purposeful because you really actually don't want to hear the perspectives of Indigenous people, but this is how it plays out with environmental racism, right? And it eventually it excludes the communities that you're trying to help. So it's just me trying to reveal what often goes into the placement of these facilities in communities, why it's happening. Because when you start to diagnose all this, as I say, then you can start thinking about the remedies. If I'm arguing that consultations are done in a Euro-Western way or approach that doesn't take into account indigenous epistemologies, if I'm saying that, then that can show us what we need to do in order to remedy that. We need to have indigenous led consultations, right? But that may not go over well with the decision makers because an indigenous led consultation may mean that you cannot place that facility in the indigenous community. And that's what ultimately industry wants. So it disrupts what they actually want to do.
Yeah.
So when I talk about these systemic issues that maybe people have not noticed, they haven't thought about because they're so embedded within our systems, I think when you reveal it, then you can get closer, I think, to the answers. When you provide recommendations or suggestions about how to deal with or address environmental racism or climate change, revealing those things allows you to think of different kinds of remedies
Mm-hmm.
for these issues.
Yeah, and I think revealing and naming and diagnosing in these kind of, pointed and fearless ways make some people very nervous. Like I've seen it in organizational spaces.
Yeah.
It's all well and good until, the language of diversity and inclusion, which is this kind of like soft and palatable language, turns into a more radical language of, as you say, disruption. Like
Hmm.
then you can no longer make decisions, navigate the world in the way that you are comfortable doing.
Yes.
And there are just more steps.
Hmm.
But I think like the thing that you argue is that those steps need to be taken. Like there's just this litany of locations that you discuss that demonstrate a pattern. And what I think is also striking is that, like, just as with the litany of locations where harm has occurred shows this kind of continuum of environmental racism, the series of accounts that you offer, especially toward the end of There's Something in the Water, are about showing the legacy of resistance and steadfastness in communities that often have to fight for their rights to clean water. With ENRICH, with the environmental noxiousness, racial inequities, and community health project, you obviously have found a structure for collective movement and power, capacity building, where you're getting funding and you're building climate change preparedness, and that is incredible. But that accomplishment has, it sounds like, come through this process of kind of iterative struggle.
Well, I knew this topic because this topic is about real harm to communities. People have cancer, respiratory illness, reproductive health issues, that it couldn't be a typical academic study. I had to provide tangible, practical benefits to the community, or nothing matters. The communities don't probably care that much about my book or my journal articles. They're dealing with immediate issues that they want to be addressed, whether they just want their water tested, but that's meaningful to them because they may never have had their water tested and they want to know what's in it so they can manage it. So I
Hmm.
knew immediately that it needed to be community based and community engaged. I didn't quite know what that meant. I just know that my PhD supervisor back in the day at the University of Toronto said, if you ever do community based research, no, he said if you're doing work with racialized communities, make sure it's community based and make sure
Hmm.
there's a policy aspect. But I didn't really get much out of that. He wasn't a big talker, for one. And I said, yeah, that makes sense, but didn't quite know what it meant. And then the ENRICH project happened. And then I said, I need to think about what he said and I need to make sure I implement it. But it was a journey for me. I think people just assume you know how to do community based research because they assume it's easy. It's actually harder because you're working with communities with different perspectives. Some of them do not trust professors. They think you're coming in there once again for your study and for your journal article and to get tenure. So there's lack of trust, and they don't think that academics really actually do anything. And I was actually very determined that it would be different and that I would provide tangible benefits and I wouldn't just do what I needed to do and then walk away and never see those communities again. So I already knew that that's what I was going to do. It wasn't a
Hmm.
project that I tell people that I never pursued it. This project, I didn't know anything about the environment, but an activist came to me and asked me to take it on. He was leaving to go to Oakland, California, to do a startup, and that was a time in Nova Scotia, 2013, if you remember, where a lot of young people in his age group, 25, 27, a little older, were leaving for
Hmm.
Calgary maybe, and there were just no jobs in Nova Scotia, and he was trying his luck in Oakland, California. So
Hmm.
I said hesitantly, yes, I'll do this because there was a health aspect to it. I knew that, and I'm a health researcher. And because it was an opportunity to work with Black communities and Indigenous communities, but the environmental part of it scared me because I knew nothing about it. But I thought, oh, it's a learning opportunity. Um, so I said yes. I knew that as I said, it had to be community engaged, but all the other things that it became, I didn't know it was going to be that. I think when I look back, everything, as I say to people, makes sense now. Um, but I really didn't
Hmm.
know what I was doing in the beginning. So I say to people, I say I was just throwing things at the wall to see what stuck. And it was very experimental at the time when I started. Is this going to
Hmm.
work? Let me try this. Okay, that didn't work. Let me try this. So throwing things at the wall. It's funny.
Hmm.
I look back, as I say, and everything makes sense. And I often say when I do presentations that I feel the Enrich Project was a journey of serendipity.
Hmm.
Things came to me that I did not pursue. And I became this voice around environmental racism in Canada, which is strange and funny because I knew
Hmm.
nothing about the environment. And I had this fear that the true environmental scientists, the people who had their PhDs in this, would call me out and say, what is Ingrid doing? What does she know? Because I really thought that you had to be an environmental scientist to do this. And then quickly I said, you know what? I'm a sociologist. I can bring something different. I don't know anything about pollutants. I still don't, and I don't know anything about contaminants, and that's what the environmental scientists do, and it's really important. But I'm a sociologist, and maybe I can bring the racism and the capitalism and the settler colonialism and the intersectionality, the things that sociologists I think do well, and then the advocacy part, because I'm still remembering the words of my doctoral supervisor who said, make sure it's community engaged and make sure there's policy. All that reverberated. And I thought to myself, maybe I can make this special. I didn't know that the first thing I needed to do was to develop relationships and that I couldn't do the standard thing that professors do, which is to make the decision on my own what the research objectives and questions should be, and then put it into ethics. Right? That's
Mm.
what we kind of have to do. We cannot interact with participants until we have ethics, and all of those things are problematic. Things that I brought to the table to the ethics
Mhm.
board. I thought it was my responsibility in Dalhousie to say this isn't working for community engaged research. This is what the community wants. I know it goes against ethics, but so I had those conversations with ethics, and I think things changed at Dalhousie a little bit.
Hmm.
Um, so I got to know the communities, and I went down to see maybe 5 or 6 Indigenous and Black communities in 2013. And I said, I'm just going to ask them what they want me to do instead of me making that decision for them. How paternalistic, right? For me to decide that. So I said, yeah, I want to hear from you. I want to know what you want me to do. And we had some nice informal conversations at these kind of small meetings. And then I had a convergence meeting with everyone, all in the Indigenous communities and Black communities in Halifax, um, in January of 2014. And then I said the next step has to be policy, reaching out to MLAs, for example, and maybe MPs. And I did that at the end of 2014, January 2015. And I was lucky at that time to meet Lenore Zan, who seemed really enthusiastic. Had never known about environmental racism, but as somebody who was born in Australia, when we were sitting down for coffee, she said, well, in Australia, when I was a little girl, I remember that the Aboriginal community, they were always near to some kind of toxic facility. Is that environmental racism? Is that what you mean, Ingrid? And I said, that's exactly it. So she
Right.
had an understanding of it, but had never really heard the term. And we set
Hmm.
out to develop a bill, a provincial bill, a Nova Scotia bill in 2015 that never went past second reading. But I knew right there that I had a cheerleader, and that it wasn't enough to do this project, to do the research, to see the activism by the Indigenous and Black communities. That needed to be partnered with policy. I knew that immediately. And I'm certainly not dismissing or downplaying the years, decades of activism on the part of Black communities and Indigenous communities in Nova Scotia. It's been stunning. And activism gives attention to issues, it gets you media attention. But then I also
Hmm.
think that that needs to be paired with legislation and policy. So, and that's what I set out to do. As I continue to learn more about the issue, I realized that something substantial needed to follow that. I needed to find someone who would take this on, and that was Lenore Zan, certainly in the beginning, and now it's Elizabeth May, now that it's a
Hmm.
federal bill. And
Hmm.
that federal bill, I think I've said already, is at Senate now, waiting to be voted on at third reading in the spring of this year. And if it passes, it will be the first environmental racism bill in Canada. But over the years, I've done everything because I don't think it's just about activism. I think addressing environmental racism or any issue is not just about activism, it's not just about policy, but it's also about education. It's also about creating awareness. It's about all the things that I did that I thought to myself, I'm just throwing things at the wall. But I realize now that everything I threw at the wall was a kind of action that will get us to environmental justice. Because when I do an event at the Halifax Central Library, for example, it might seem innocuous, but ultimately what happened is that people who didn't know about the issue, people who were doubtful, who attended my events, and I put on a ton of events when I was in Halifax, I don't do that anymore. Ultimately, I would get people who would want to meet with me the day after, sit in my office, ask me how they can help, and also show me another path. One
Right.
person like that was Fred Bonner, who's a geologist. I never thought I'd be working with a geologist. That's why, I've opened myself up through the ENRICH Project to every discipline and
Yeah.
every person. I never said no. People would say, can I meet with you in your office? And every time I said yes, because I started to realize that when I let people in, people people showed me another path, like Fred Bonner, who said, loved your event last night, but have you ever thought of testing water? Have you ever thought of giving the community something tangible? That's what he said. And I was
Hmm.
immediately kind of taken aback and maybe a bit insulted, because I thought to myself, I'm doing research, I'm doing community engagement, I'm doing events, I'm doing legislation. What more do you want? That was my
Yeah.
initial reaction in my head, and I was a bit perturbed. And then I said to myself, shut up, Ingrid. Just keep your mouth shut and listen to this man. And thank God I did. And he said, well, have you thought of testing water? And I just said, well, I'm a sociologist. What would I know about that? He said, well, I'm a geologist, and we can form a working group with some other folks, and let's test the water of the folks in Lincolnville and Shelburne, and we did it. And I started to realize that not only was this an interdisciplinary issue, but that I needed to engage and invite in people from different disciplines, because once again, the solution to environmental racism is interdisciplinary work. I think I found and the communities a lot of success because I was that open and
Mm.
because I'm very interested in partnerships. Enrich has been intersectional,
Hmm.
it's been interdisciplinary, it's been multidisciplinary, it's been multi approach.
Yeah.
That's the way to do any project on any topic. And I think it's led me to where I'm at right now.
And I think, the thing I hear and that I've heard from other local groups here in Nova Scotia, for example, Everyone Every Day, is that you're also kind of building trust, right? Like within this group, you're building a degree of trust, and you're also like building the ability to identify who you can't trust. That like
Mm.
that's part of the that's part of the point is that while there isn't maliciousness necessarily, there are malicious forces that are making the land unlivable, making water unavailable.
Hmm.
And so I think like that's what's so inspiring to me about the model that you just described is that it's like opening the door to this kind of collective capacity building, I guess. And the thing too, I guess, for me is when you describe the recognition of your own sort of disciplinary limitations or what have you, like you're also saying that you knew you could fill a need, that like your particular skill set, especially around communications and providing this kind of social criticism,
Yes.
that fulfilled a need that's
Yes.
like environmental science simply was not
No.
able to fill.
No.
you know and I think people know that the film There's Something in the Water came through a partnership with Elliot Page,
Mm.
and Elliot Page has also kind of been connected, continues to be connected with Enrich to some extent. I don't know if you wanted to unpack that at all, just because it is this sort of celebrity connection. Like,
Yeah.
to what extent do those kind of high profile bumps, those boosts that you get from being able to connect with someone who has that kind of celebrity, benefit a movement, and are there limitations to that celebrity?
Well, I said earlier that this has been a journey in serendipity.
Right.
Once again, the Elliot Page factor, serendipity, like
Mm.
finding Elliot on my enriched Twitter page one morning, October of 2018, but not recognizing that it was the actor. Just saw a new follower and said, oh, new follower, because the photo of Elliot was just quite obscure. The coloring of the photo was like, what's the color? Sepia. And
Hmm.
Elliot was wearing like a chapeau. And
Hmm.
I just didn't recognize the face, but I just said to myself, oh, new follower. And then I went back 4 weeks later, and there was so much activity on the Twitter page, and that Twitter page was much more quiet than my personal Twitter page. And I noticed the comments were about my book, promoting the book, which is a great thing because the book had come out in 2018, which is when Elliot was on my Twitter page. It came out in 2018. So, yeah, I was looking for some promotion. I was doing all the things that
Sure.
academics do. I was traveling to Montreal and Ottawa to do book launches, but promoting my book with his over 2 million followers at that time. Sure, he has more now. I thought, wow. And promoting and supporting the women on the front lines, the Indigenous and Black women on the front lines, and promoting the ENRICH Project, I was kind of stunned. And I said, I guess it is the actor, and I had seen Juno twice. I loved it. Didn't know who Elliot Page was when I watched you, and I was like, "Who is this person?" Because this person is blowing everybody off the screen. I mean, there was Jennifer Garner, the actress in that film, and others who were much more experienced. But I didn't know Elliot at that time, and I said, "This actor, whoever this actor is blowing everybody off the screen." And I also saw Inception with Leonardo DiCaprio, so I'm like, "Is that the actor?" And I realized it was. And I thought the best thing to do, of course, is to reach out and say thank you because he's promoting the book. And there
Mm-hmm.
began a relationship where we had a three-way call with Lil McPherson, who you will know, who owns the Wooden Monkey in Dartmouth and Halifax. I was
Mm-hmm.
on a committee with Lil. Is it Lil McPherson?
I
Uh,
think so.
yes,
Yeah.
I was on a committee through the Ecology Action Center in Halifax, and I think I might have mentioned Elliot Page reached out to me, and then Lil said, "Oh, I've known him for like 15, 20 years. Do you want me to connect you?" And I'm like, "Yes." So at the end of December, the week of Christmas 2018, we were connected. And then we continued the conversation in 2019 January, this time with some of the indigenous women, probably from Pictou Landing First Nation and Sabaganagadi First Nation. And we had settled kind of on maybe short 10-minute video clips that we would post on Twitter to create awareness. It became a documentary later because after visiting Elliot's mother's home, they allowed me to look at the film in full, and I noticed how emotional the film was. And I thought slapping it onto Twitter isn't going to do this topic justice. And if my goal with the ENRICH Project, one goal is to create more awareness because people think environmental racism is this strange term and they didn't understand it. And I also know that creating awareness creates empathy as well. And then when you create empathy, you create action, because I've seen that with my ENRICH
Mm.
Project, that people come to me and they say they've never heard of it. Then they learn about it. Then they learn about the systemic underpinnings of environmental racism. Then they get a little bit more empathic. And then when they get empathic, they say, "How can I help, Ingrid?" Like, I've seen it, right? So I thought we need something bigger. And that's when we decided to do a full length documentary. And then it went to TIFF and then it went to Netflix. I mean, this is, I'm still shocked by it, to be honest
Really?
with you, that all of this happened with a celebrity. And
Yeah.
certainly it helped, of course, having Elliot talk about it in Time
Yeah.
magazine when the film came out. I mean, we were in Time magazine, we were on Entertainment Tonight Canada, we were in Rolling Stone magazine. I give a
Yeah.
lot of credit to Elliot to broadening the discussion across Canada. So, this is what a lot of academics want. We talk about knowledge mobilizing all the time as academics. How do we
Sure.
go beyond the journal article to have wider appeal, to share this with the public? Boy, did that do it. To have a Netflix a documentary based on my very first book, to
Yeah.
have it screened at TIFF, and to have all the other gifts that have come with that
Yeah.
Netflix. I mean, there have been so many gifts that I don't remember, that I can't share with you, that have come as a result of it being on Netflix. It's just
Yeah.
opened
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
conversation. I mean, the amount of professors now that are teaching about environmental racism, where before they were teaching about sustainability. You
For
know,
sure.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Sustainability, this broad topic that doesn't really, to me, examine the issue of power. And I hear
No.
from
Yeah.
professors now, they're talking about environmental racism. They're asking me to come to talk about environmental racism. When in the past, they would ask me to talk about sustainability or squeeze my talk about environmental racism into a sustainability panel. I was
Right.
always being squeezed in. That's all changed. And yes, that has a lot to do with my work. It has to do with the Indigenous and Black communities on the front lines, but it also has to do with Elliot Page. I'll never deny it.
No. Yeah. And I think like I find now when sustainability gets used, it's almost like a red flag that there is
Yes,
something like greenwashing happening,
yes,
because it's just this toothless term. It's not even
yes,
wondering what is being sustained or what needs
yes,
to be abstained from. Like it's just saying words.
yes.
Um, and yeah, I think it's undeniable, right, that knowledge mobilization has to be about doing and
Hmm.
not, merely saying. So, like, if the words have become stale and nobody's doing anything, then
Hmm.
you're not getting anywhere. So, I do want to ask about your background in health research, and what that particular skill set, I guess, or perspective brings to the conversation. Because when I was doing an English and cultural studies degree at McMaster University, like the moment I started to see this discourse of critical health studies and get a taste for what it could do in terms of broadening notions of health, I was hooked. And In the conversations, I guess, that you're currently having with folks, do you feel as though maybe post COVID, there has been a sort of transformation in terms of like understanding what is sometimes called social determinants of health, and in particular, the kind of racially stratified intersectional social determinants of health? Do you see any sort of lasting shift within the discourse around environmental racism and the radicalizing of notions of health in Canada?
Yeah, I often say that place is one of the biggest social determinants of health. Food security, green space, the built environment, trees, canopy, etc. Access to health services in your neighborhood or near to your neighborhood, transportation that is affordable and accessible. The communities that tend to be in out of the way or isolated places, such as many African Nova Scotian communities, and the communities that are on reserve, like Indigenous communities, are the communities that are disproportionately burdened by toxic facilities. So we already know that there are inequities in terms of toxic burdens based on where one lives. What COVID showed us is something very similar, that the communities, same communities that are living in these areas, including urban communities, of course, were also disproportionately impacted by COVID for a number of reasons. I mean, those reasons also included um, the fact that those communities that tend to be low income are the communities that are more likely to work in essential services. So, thereby, those are people who are more likely to be exposed to COVID. They don't have the privilege of working from home. Um, Racialized communities often live in multi generational homes where they're living with grandparents, perhaps, and aunts and uncles. Uh, Therefore, that exposes you more to COVID. So, the kind of underlying issue with COVID, where in the beginning, when COVID hit, I think there was a lot of discussion about the elderly, and rightly so. The elderly
Mm-hmm.
were actually discussed more than any other group as a group that had existing comorbidities, and those comorbidities exposed them to COVID. But as we went along, we started to see that the same communities that are impacted by environmental racism are the same communities that were impacted by COVID. I mean, we've always known that certain communities, the communities that are low income, racialized, have higher rates of various illnesses, right? So they're more impacted by various health issues precisely because they're low income, precisely because they're racialized, and precisely because of where they live, as well as the fact that they underutilize health services for a number of reasons. Um, but I think during COVID, it amplified that for many of us. One of the benefits, I think, of COVID is that it amplified those inequities. And
Mm-hmm.
I guess the benefit is in the fact that if it's amplified and we have a greater awareness about it, then we understand that we need to address it.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, like, if we're thinking about those things, right, like the kind of pressing needs of, communities that are ensnared in what you call this kind of web of inequalities, then, the public health system is actually like more functional. But, I wanted to kind of pick up on something that you said earlier in the conversation. The idea that racial must go with capitalism,
Hmm.
that like part of the structure, it really like makes it, part of the structure in particular of racial capitalism makes it very difficult for, people to seek health, people to cultivate health. And, it reminded me of something that Ruth Wilson Gilmore actually said yesterday on a Haymarket Books live stream, that when theorists say racial capitalism, they are not talking about a difference between like good capitalism, the capitalism we would prefer, and racial capitalism. It's like a racial capitalism in the way that you formulate it is like The two things are indissociable. Gilmore says like it's not some dynamic within capitalism in which white people do to people who are not white these nefarious things. It's like actually built into the structure of capitalism.
Mhm. I mean, racial capitalism certainly is entrenched or inextricably linked
Mm-hmm.
to our social structures, but also gender and patriarchy. Our structures, our society is built upon heteropatriarchy, racial capitalism, gender divisions, sexism, and classism. I chose to focus on racial capitalism specifically, but
Mm-hmm.
you can also never talk about race without talking about gender, sexism, heteropatriarchy, and all the other divisions. So that's kind of how I wanted people to understand the framework, I guess, within which environmental racism sits. It's not happening in faculties of medicine and schools of health where people are looking at these issues, these social structures, the social determinants of health. It's starting to happen, but it's still not prized as the kind of knowledge that faculties of medicine and health professions want to share with their students. They're still entrenched in Western models, biomedical approaches to understanding health, and the structural determinants of health are often dismissed and undermined. The way I like to teach health, because of course I'm doing it from a sociological perspective, I'm from a different discipline, is for my
Mm-hmm.
students to understand capitalism as it connects to gentrification, as that connects to environmental racism, as it connects also to public infrastructure inequalities and the built environment. I want students to have a framework of capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and neoliberalism to be able to kind of talk about these issues as health issues, because to most folks, these are not health issues. So it's a framework that I use because I think it's one that a lot of sociologists are very comfortable discussing. But I
Mm-hmm.
think with health professionals and environmental scientists, that's not happening, and that has a lot to do with just training. Just like I am limited, in my own way, I'm not an environmental scientist. I realize that I do have a place in this because I can offer a different perspective. And that perspective was what was in my book, which is, talking about neoliberalism and its connection to environmental racism and racial capitalism. And I think these are perhaps difficult but important frameworks for people in health and people in engineering and anybody who's interested in environmental racism to think about.
Yeah.
Because the social or structural determinants of health framework is basically built on all of the policies, actions, decision making that are happening within our social structures that then impact people on the ground and have tangible, practical impacts on people's health and more broadly people's well-being. But in order to
Mm-hmm.
talk about the impacts on people's well-being and their health, we have to talk about those structural issues. And neoliberalism, heteropatriarchy, and racial capitalism are built within our social structures. So, yeah, it's important to
Yeah.
excavate those things so we understand how health and wellness happens for people and how
Mm.
illness manifests.
I 100% agree. Like that's where I operate from. And the challenges that I find, like the ways in which to use your terminology, I feel kind of limited at times, is in this like dedication to the truth of that, the truth of a relationship to land, for example, like
Hmm.
the natural world being itself like undeniably a determinant of health, like
Hmm.
there's that book by Raj Patel and Rupa Maria, Inflame, that basically says like our current state of chronic inflammation that takes a million different forms is really about a kind of disequilibrium with the natural world. That's the product of kind of what you termed like petropatriarchy. Um, it's hard in the discipline of communications where I often teach to encourage communicators, at different levels, to imagine crafting health campaigns that, communicate this kind of radical, understanding of health being about this equilibrium.
Yes.
It's like, what are you suggesting that they actually market to people? What are you trying to encourage them to do in terms of actually crafting messages that will empower people
Hmm.
to seek health? It really goes against a lot of the ways in which they're professionalized to communicate health as entirely the domain of individual responsibility.
Hmm.
Like that's the easy sell in a way. It's like, be afraid of obesity, be afraid of chemical exposure, be
Hmm.
afraid of this and that. That absolutely motivates certain people that can afford to worry about those forms of exposure, but it does nothing to actually move the needle in terms of public health, like outcome writ large.
Yes. Indigenous people know this well, right? Because the indigenous
Hmm.
epistemology is
Hmm.
about holism. Their ways of knowing is all about holism, and their understandings of health are in line with that. That they know that there needs to be a balance,
Hmm.
harmony between land, body, animals, plants, etc. That there needs to be that equilibrium, and if there isn't, then things are out of balance, and then well-being is compromised. So that's in line with
Hmm.
indigenous epistemology, and and with other epistemologies around the world, of
Sure.
course, right? Eastern philosophy and certainly African indigenous understandings of health. It's just taking the health system and medical schools and health professions to catch up. It's taking a long
Yeah.
time.
And I don't, it's I'm really curious about strategies for I guess strategies of solidarity and translation that, for example, look at the climate crisis or zoonotic spillover of diseases as examples of disequilibrium that can like operate sort of like focusing events and open up, at least for a moment, this space in which people are less inclined to sort of dismiss alternative, let's say, cosmologies, or at least
Hmm.
non-white epistemologies,
Yes.
and yeah, just like encourage people to look a little bit more deeply, because yeah, as you write, the interrelatedness between the physical body and intimate spiritual relationships with the land is, for example, part of the conception of health within Anishinaabe communities and culture. And you say, like, we have to contextualize, for example, environmental racism in indigenous communities with these like long-standing, with the imposition of a settler colonial system that denies
Hmm.
any autonomy when it comes to like cultivating that notion of health.
Hmm.
There is maybe some potential for translation in the language of a certain spiritual relationship to health. Like it's often rendered in purely consumeristic ways,
Hmm.
like Gwyneth Paltrow and Goop or something. Like you can still buy it, you can still go out and buy it,
Yes.
but I do see some ways in which like that resonates for people, like a conception of health outside of just like profit seeking and the purchasing of health. Is that Have you found
Hmm.
that at all in your classes, for example? Do you have you Where
Hmm.
have you seen these kinds of conversations, even conversations that have friction in them, amount to kind of a generative place when it comes to integrating spirituality into health?
Well, those conversations definitely happen in my classes. Students' response to it, I don't know. Some students
Mm,
might keep it to themselves. What they think to themselves. I know that my career has been about, for whatever reason, I'm not sure why, teaching in disciplines that
mm,
are not my own. My whole career has been that. I've never taught, well, I taught part time in a sociology department, but since I became an academic, full time academic, I've been teaching in disciplines that are not my own, which is actually quite interesting because it allows me to get people out of their box. So the conceptualizations and theories that they may have in nursing, having somebody like me, a sociologist, get them out of the nursing box or the occupational therapy box and use theories from other disciplines like sociology to have them conceptualize various issues in different ways is actually an interesting challenge and one that I enjoy and has just become my career. So when I moved to Halifax and started teaching at Dalhousie, first I was in the School of Occupational Therapy, and then I moved to the School of Nursing. I am neither one of those professions, but I'm a sociologist of health. And in all my classes, I was probably in many ways introducing students fully to the structural and social determinants of health and non European, non Western understandings of health. And that was probably disconcerting to some who were in those programs to learn, in the case of nursing, how to put a needle in someone.
Right.
And I was unpopular for quite some time, and there were actually complaints against me to my director in nursing specifically, not understanding what Ingrid Waldron is teaching. Why is Ingrid teaching here in the School
Right.
of Nursing? Why is she teaching us this? Why is she teaching us sociology? Was what one student said. Um, I had a really hard time wondering whether or not this was the profession for me. Thankfully, the director supported me because this is exactly what she wanted them to learn. And she also said she wanted nursing to be seen as much more academic than it's seen. It's seen as a profession, but isn't necessarily seen as kind of intellectually rigorous or as an academic field. And that's
Mhm.
what she wanted. Um, all what I was talking about was race and ethnicity and gender and holism and spirituality and the structural determinants of health. And yeah, the students had a hard time with it. Um, so I was having that conversation. There was some talk about the medical school at Dalhousie starting up a new course on the structural determinants of health. I had developed one
Mhm.
for nursing. I don't know if it ever happened, but there was some talk about that and maybe having me teach the course or somehow. I felt there was some progression on that. I think as I went along in the School of Nursing, what I was teaching became much more palatable. Students started to get it, and I think the School of Nursing was trying to support that work and to make sure that what I was teaching was something that was integrated into every professor's course. So it didn't seem jarring to students when they took my course or kind of out of place. I remember, I had a particular class in 2013 that was extremely difficult, hard on me. Um, but yeah, not understanding why I was teaching what I was teaching. Why was I hired? This is not nursing. This is sociology. And then I remember 3 years later, I was opening the door to my office, and a student from that class, probably 5 years earlier, approached me. She was coming to see another professor, but she saw me opening my office door and she said, Dr. Waldron, I really want to apologize for that class back in 2013.
Mm.
We were out of line. I now see everything that you taught. I see it now. I'm a nurse now, and I see it in the hospitals. And I kind of feel sorry for the older nurses who did not have the privilege of taking your course because they didn't have courses like the structural determinants of health in those days. So I look at the older nurses and I feel sorry for them that they didn't have a chance to take a course like yours. And I was like, I was happy, of course, but I was like,
Yeah,
now
yeah.
she gets it, because I was trying to impress upon them the importance of this, particularly because it's not just about putting a needle in somebody's arm. You shouldn't feel that that's the most important thing. You are dealing with patients that are going to be increasingly diverse in Halifax as Halifax becomes more racially and culturally diverse. And part of dealing with people as a nurse, dealing with patients, is to be culturally competent, is to understand people from different backgrounds and different um, ways of knowing. And that's what comes with it, different ways of knowing. People who you are going to see who have different belief systems about mental illness, about where mental illness comes from, about how one should treat mental illness, about health in general. So it's not just an exercise in putting in a needle. It's about building trust with community members. And what I was teaching was part of that. I agree, maybe not, that environmental and social determinants of health isn't the top issue that a nurse should be focused on. Yes, they should know how to
Sure.
put a needle in. If you're going to see a nurse yourself, that you want to make sure they have the
Sure.
technical skills. But it's very important what I was teaching,
Absolutely.
and yeah, so it wasn't received well in 2013. And I think now there's much more discussion on the structural and social determinants of health. But regardless, I will still say to you that it's not being integrated um,
Mm.
enough in medical
Yeah.
schools and in the health professions. We're still not there.
And there's a kind of logic of just like expediency or emergency that seems to underpin the whole health profession, especially
Yes.
post COVID.
Yes.
These backlogs and the kind of understaffed and
Hmm.
overextended
Yes.
nature of the profession maybe, throws it out of balance. It's just like we have no time for this consideration of the roots.
Yeah.
But I take your point that we do still require a comprehensive, multi pronged strategy designed, I'm quoting you, of course, to dismantle the underlying structural elements
Yes.
that sustain the conditions, right, for disequilibrium and
Hmm.
disease. Otherwise, we're just constantly treating the symptoms. And yeah, I mean, the thing too is like that's such an incredible story of the kind of the apology and the
Yeah.
awakening and the capacity to see.
Yes.
um I think part of the function in some ways of writing books is so that you don't have to constantly explain why you're there.
Hmm.
And to that point, like the book has in its title the word water, and I don't know that we've like actually kind of zoomed in on the question of water. One of the sections of There's Something in the Water talks about fracking. This is the kind of main way that you talk about extraction within Canada, and you talk especially about the kind of uprising in some ways of Elsipogtog First Nation against hydrofracking in New Brunswick. And I just kind of wondered if you wanted to speak to how you see the struggle over water in the 21st century, because like I'm talking really globally, and how especially like you're seeing indigenous peoples stand against this like completely presentist attitude of neoliberal capitalism that says we don't have to even think about what's in the water, because we're somehow buffered from its worst effects.
Hmm.
Yeah, what are the politics of water as a whole right now? Has anything changed since you wrote that book?
I don't think anything anything has changed. I think I appreciated how important water is because I've collaborated or developed relationships with Indigenous communities in Nova Scotia, and there's always this saying or this call from the Indigenous community: "Water is life." Right?
Hmm.
Water is
Hmm.
life. It's something that's said repeatedly by Indigenous communities, and that's kind of just part of the vernacular now, that water is life. And this is the Indigenous community trying to impress upon all of us that water is everywhere. It's about everything. And
Hmm.
I don't, I, and of course, we as a community, as a world, we take it for granted. They don't take it for granted because they have issues around water, not enough water, what do you call it in their communities? We have communities across, Indigenous communities across Canada that have issues with sufficient water and contamination of water. So this directly impacts them, but it impacts all of us because water is in everything, in our bodies, in our food. We need water to survive. We need water to live. So I think
Hmm.
when they try to remind us of that, that impacts me, and it makes me realize that what I'm fighting for, I guess, and what the ENRICH Project is trying to address is an issue that goes beyond certainly Indigenous communities. That we all have to take that seriously. I remember I was talking about that to someone
Hmm.
about. Indigenous communities call to people to remember the water, the importance of the water. Water is life. And I remember that person rolling his eyes in a way,
Mm.
almost like he's tired of that call, that push to remind us of how important water is, that water is life. There was a
Right.
kind of a rolling,
Like a physical expression of dismissiveness. Yeah.
yeah, like I'm sick of hearing about it. And it kind of made me feel that he felt that there was some kind of division where that should be important to the Indigenous community, but it's not important to the rest of us. And I wish they would shut up about it. And I
Wow.
thought, wow, this is simply the Indigenous community reminding us that is important to all of us. And as
Hmm.
water protectors, and they often say, right, that we are water protectors, they are not just protecting the waters for Indigenous communities, they're also doing it for all of us.
Mm.
So we should be thankful for that. And we should also mention that this is not, water is not an Indigenous issue, although it has greater impacts on them. It's an issue that we all have to um, see as important as a priority.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's to me it symbolizes water symbolizes so much.
Mm.
Certainly in what I do, of course, air pollution as well. But much of my work, I think, has focused more on water contamination and addressing water issues, whether it be in Shelburne or helping and supporting Indigenous communities around water issues.
Yeah.
But I just remember that person, that person rolling his eyes, and I thought he was. Well, I just saw there was some ignorance in it, as if it was something that the rest of us didn't have to deal with. It was an Indigenous issue, and he was tired of hearing about it.
Well, I mean, it's like it's utterly it's like it's pretty arrogant, and the arrogance is clearly derived from the fact that like most Canadians in most white Canadians, let's say at the very least, enjoy water security like
Yes.
that. I think that's an important term. Like we talk
Yes.
about food security, we talk
Hmm.
about maybe energy security, but I think
Mm.
because of that complacency and that arrogance, few people have that concept in their heads of
Yes.
water security. It's just not on our radar.
There you go. That's it, because we have the privilege, many of us, of being on municipal water. I think of also, Shelburne, the African Nova Scotian community in Shelburne, which has been on well water since they came to Nova Scotia, and the north end of the community, which is predominantly white, they've been on municipal town water, which is cleaner, of course, right?
Mhm.
So those who have the privilege to be on town water and municipal water may not see water as important because they take it for granted.
Mhm.
Um, so you're right. It comes out of that privilege where you feel you don't have to think about this because it's something that you take for granted because you've always had.
And I think it also just amplifies the importance of policy,
Hmm.
which you talk a lot about, and you're pretty militant about, like pushing for progressive policy. Just
Hmm.
I think like laying bare the inadequacies of policy, and also the kind of racism that's written into a lot of policy. Like
Hmm.
as you say, Canadian law, policy, and practice does not provide a legislative framework for safe drinking water for Indigenous on reserve populations. Like it's in the policy that's not provided.
Hmm.
So I think making that visible and pushing people to feel like they have a role in changing policy, that to me is actually something that should represent a new mentality within health communications. Like, why not craft health campaigns that are about encouraging people to advocate for healthier policies,
Hmm.
right? That will, reshape the structure and repair relationships with nature.
Right. Well, when I talk about how racism is inscribed within policy in one part of the book,
Hmm.
I'm also trying to show that it's not obvious, it's kind of covert,
Sure.
and that the people who write those policies, it's inscribed in it. It's similar to what we talked about um, earlier about capitalism being embedded.
Hmm.
Things get so embedded and so inscribed that sometimes you can't see it. And for me to just mention that is to highlight it or excavate it or to reveal it to people who are just going about, policymakers who are going about their business as usual, who aren't
Hmm.
necessarily going to see this or understand that. And to me, that is the first step in addressing through policy some of these issues, because we tend to forget that people are doing business as usual. And you have a policymaker who then leaves, and the next policymaker who comes into that position is doing what everybody else is doing, not necessarily recognizing that they're part of a racist process. That's, to be honest with you, I don't believe that
Hmm.
everybody understands that they're doing what seems
No.
normal to them. So
Yeah,
for
yeah.
me to highlight that and to talk about how it's inscribed is a way to say that it's extremely systemic, like most things, is not always visible to the eye, and not to the eye necessarily of the policymaker. It manifests over time because it's not visible. And one way to address some of these issues is to make it visible. If it's not visible, then nobody's going to think of addressing it because they don't see it. It's similar to what I said about environmental assessments.
Hmm.
Um, Environmental assessments are not set up to think about the social determinants of health. The fact that when you put a facility in an indigenous community, or you're putting it in a community that's already compromised in terms of their health, who are dealing with very serious structural determinants of health, it's not set up to think about that. An environmental assessment is all about, where do we place this facility? But if it was done with more context in terms of, why put it in communities that are already dealing with serious determinants of health, maybe a different decision would be made. But these are business as usual practices where people are not thinking about the social determinants of health, and how putting an industry there in that community, in that indigenous community, is going to further compromise that community with respect to food security, with respect to health, with respect to other structural determinants of health. So it's a policy is important in terms of addressing it, but if the people who are making those policies are not aware of how deeply inscribed racism, sexism, classism, all of the isms are within policy, then there would be no reason why they would want to address it, because it's not visible to them.
Mm.
Um, that's what systemic. That's what systemic racism is. That's what systemic inequality is. And I think in Canada, there's a lot of difficulty in detecting it, because many of us are not educated about it. And if something is not overt and obvious, then we dismiss it.
Right, and often even in the face of these so-called focusing events, these crises, it is possible for people that are kind of protected from the immediate impacts to kind of look away, or not see in it the reality of suffering. The fact of the crisis of the number of unhoused people right now in this municipality alone is something that I think, like, the way that you perceive it determines, like, your attitude, your sense of the reality of the situation. And I just really can't thank you enough for sharing your insights, which is like boundless, like just recognizing these systemic factors and helping others cognize these kind of hidden causes of so many of the kind of social ills that we are still struggling with and placing band-aid solutions on.
Yes.
It's a honor, actually, to be able to talk to you about these things.
Oh, I had a great time speaking with you. I really enjoyed this conversation. Really made me think, and challenge me as well. Challenge me on what I wrote in the book as well, to think through it in a deeper way.